Hello, I'm Jeff Van Treese, and this is Mobilized News. We welcome you to our show as we have Dr. Dale Taylor back. Dr. Dale is a professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. He's a neuroscientist, and he also actually started the program of music therapy, combining music with neuroscience, and he's done a lot of great work on a lot of areas. And he's here to join us to talk about the horrible tragedy that we recently observed with Tyre Nichols, which we now have second-degree murder charges for. And I'd love to get your thoughts, Dale, on this horrible tragedy and the role that perhaps neuroscientists can play in understanding sort of our collective understanding of systemic racism. So, Dale, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So what can we take away from this, from kind of a broad perspective, the way that we perceive race and perceive racism from a neurological perspective? What can we take away, and how can we move forward?
Well, I think it's important to understand what's going on from a neurological perspective. I know when I first began to try to understand why so many Black people were the victims of police brutality, I tried to understand it from a social perspective, from just a perspective of pure racism, but it was so pervasive and so much of it, I thought there had to be something underlying going on that's affecting people at large to make it so pervasive. And what I've learned is that, and what I think people need to realize is that the human brain can only uh, respond to and react and behave based on the information that it has. And whatever information goes into that brain has a tremendous effect on what comes out. And what we see is that, and of course, right now there's a lot of controversy about whether uh, the race of the victim or the race of the policeman has an effect on police brutality. And we've always thought it was a bunch of racist white policemen that were targeting Black citizens. And to some degree, that's true. And in some cases, there are those instances. But now we see, and we've seen before, this is not the first time, that Black policemen have been indicted, fired, uh, and received punishments like that for victimizing Black citizens. And of course, the reason has to do with racism itself. It doesn't have to do with the race of the people, other than the victim, because Black policemen are just as susceptible to what I call implanted racism as white policemen. Um, Let me explain to you what I mean. Um, we, the news media has talked about implicit bias, but implicit bias, racial bias, has to get there somehow, and it gets there by implanted racism ideas. And the best example I can give you is one that I grew up with and was always furious at is how the news media, when reporting crime, they always reported the race of the suspect or the race of the convict if it was a Black person, but they didn't report anybody else's race. And I thought to myself, well, there's very few Black criminals compared to all the white criminals, but they never say that the white criminals are white. So what's happening is that the Black criminals or Black people are even uh, getting blamed in the mind of the public for crimes committed by whites. Now, that sounds like a far-reaching statement, but let me explain to you what I mean. I'll give you an example that'll explain to you what I mean. A few years ago, when I moved to Madison, Wisconsin to take a job as a music therapist, I moved into an apartment. And about a week after I moved in, the landlady called me And she said, don't be offended if the two girls upstairs move out. And I said, why should I be offended if two girls move out of this apartment house that you have? And she said, well, because they're white girls and they're moving out because you're black. And the reason is that the only thing that they've ever heard that black people do is rape, rob, and kill. And they called to ask her how long she thought it would be before I raped, robbed, or killed them. And she said that's all they've ever heard because their only impressions are from the news media. And I called probably about a year later. I called the news when I heard a report on the radio about there had been some sort of robbery in town, and they were reporting that the suspect was black, but they didn't report. That's all they reported, that it was a black male. And so I called the news and I asked them. I said, you know, did the police ask you uh, to broadcast a description of the suspect as being black to help catch him? And they said no. And I said, well, why do you report the race of the person without reporting his name? And you never report the race of white suspects. And they said, well, because it's assumed if we don't mention race, um, that the suspect is white. Well, at that time, that was before I began studying neuroscience. I had, I think, one course in elementary neurology. But now, as I've studied neuroscience and am up on where the field is at, I know that the way the brain works is that the human brain is not going to fill in something that might be logical if they thought about it. They're going to fill in what they've heard. So if all that comes in is a suspect is black, a suspect is black, and then they hear that there's a suspect and they don't hear the race, they're going to automatically fill in that it's black. Just as if someone said to you that there's a very clear summer sky, you're going to automatically fill in blue, even though blue wasn't mentioned. And the person might have been talking about a night sky. Or if a celebrity is coming to town and you say, we're going to roll out the carpet for them, well, automatically you're going to fill in red carpet. But if you go there, the carpet might be green or chartreuse. But that's just the way the human brain works. I tried a little experiment with someone that I know, a man that I know. This is a white man that I know. And I asked him, I said, have you ever noticed that when they report crimes, they report that the person is African American, and they don't report any other things? He said, yes. He says, I noticed that they're African. I said, what goes through your head when they don't say that it's an African American? Do you think that, oh, that was a white man? He said, no. He said, what goes through my head is that I think, well, it wasn't a black person this time. So automatically they're tying together the crime and the black race, even when it's not a black person. So, and policemen are subject to that same thinking also, whether they're black or white.